Welcome to the BBC's Global News podcast on YouTube. I'm Andrew Peach. I'm joined today by the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack. Simon, we hear a lot about how the conflict has sent the world economy into turmoil. What does that mean right now for people like you and me?
Well, two things to mention. I think, first of all, it's impossible to overstate how pervasive energy prices are. By that, I mean they get into the cost of just about everything. Some obvious ways, like when you fill up with petrol, gasoline, we've seen those prices rise. And of course, we've seen the price of gas. And for a lot of people, that means home heating. We've seen those rise. But it goes deeper than that. It goes, for example, fertilizer is made with gas, with other crude oil extracts in it. And so that starts feeding into food prices. So you can see that there are so many ways that energy prices get into the price of everything. So the obvious ones, in the UK, we've seen petrol prices go from £1.32 a litre to £1.42 a litre since these hostilities began. And that's before the big spike we've seen in the last 48 hours. So I'd expect another 5-10 pence on those. Same for diesel. In the UK, we import more of that than we refine. So those are some of the issues. And obviously, the gas prices will add to lots of industrial processes and home heating. So the other thing that matters is not only their pervasiveness, but how important it is how long these hostilities go on for. Now, there's been a lot of talk about maybe a few weeks, maybe it wouldn't. But in the last 48 hours, Israel hit an Iranian gas field. Iran then retaliated with hitting a Qatari gas field. And up to now, everyone's been sort of bending over backwards not to hit the energy infrastructure. Even when the US attacked Karg Island, huge big base of Saudi, they were going after the military installation there, not the energy installation. And so what this has done is sort of crossed a bit of a Rubicon, which is it's bringing the energy infrastructure in. And that's what has seen energy prices surge again today and has made people think, well, if we have this tit-for-tat energy infrastructure kind of strikes, then that could and will make this conflict last longer and have a more damaging impact on energy prices and the world economy.
Because Donald Trump said a few days ago himself, we've left the pipes, didn't he? We purposely didn't take out the pipes. We could, but we don't want to do that because we know what impact that will have.
And there's a conflict, the US looking furious and sounding furious that Israel struck Iran. And by the way, that Iranian plant they struck, it mainly supplies domestic gas to the Iranian people. Didn't really matter much for exports to the rest of the world. But the retaliation on the Ras Laffan installation, the Qatari one, that is 20% of world liquefied natural gas. So that was the thing that basically suddenly something that seemed kind of contained has gone beyond that, is now not contained. And that's why we've seen this extra surge in the last 24 hours.
Donald Trump says the US has all the oil it needs. It's certainly less reliant on imported oil than other countries. So how does that play into his decision-making here?
Well, it does have all the oil it needs. In fact, over the last 20 years, the shale fracking revolution in the US has turned the US into the biggest producer and exporter of oil and gas in the world, overtaking Saudi Arabia in some cases, in some measures. That doesn't mean that the price doesn't move. And in fact, I was looking at US gasoline, what they call petrol prices there. Before these hostilities started, they were $2.98 a gallon. They're now $3.84. So they've gone up, that's up a third in that period. Now, the US voter and consumer is incredibly sensitive to that. It's one of those things that you do all the time. Inflation, when you notice it on things that you do regularly, like fill up your car. And again, we're coming into that season, which in America, they call it the driving season over the US. Remember that everyone lives in their car in the US. People are very sensitive to that. So that creates a big political problem for Donald Trump. So although they are self-sufficient, it doesn't mean that the price don't go up. Because by the way, lots of people are buying gasoline, liquid natural gas from the US, and will be buying even more of it to make up for some of the shortfalls we're seeing coming out of the Gulf.
in the end of the conflict is likely to be decided by Donald Trump, who is going to be under domestic pressure. He's got midterm elections coming up later in the year. Gas prices are already going up. A lot of his own supporters are not that keen on involvement in the war anyway.
Yeah, well, he had two sort of election promises: no foreign forever wars, and I'll make sure that the cost of living goes down. You have cheaper gasoline. Both of those look, well, blown out of the water, frankly. So you're right, and a lot of people have been using Donald Trump's political pain threshold on this as a kind of benchmark for how long this conflict will actually go on. I think that's getting more complicated now. I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that although he was very hazy about what the precise objectives of this conflict were, and some people say that's so that he could declare victory and at any point and say, well, I've done what I'm now telling you was the point that I was trying to make. I think it's getting harder and harder now to extricate himself from this without ongoing, conflict in the region. Now that so many other countries have been brought in, some European leaders are saying, we're reluctant to go in and try and help clear up the mess, saying, you broke it, you own it. So he's in a difficult political position, and but he will not certainly won't want to be having aircraft carriers in the Gulf when he's going into midterm elections in November. That's going to be crucial.
We had an energy crisis affecting Europe when we saw the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There was a lot of talk then about the need for the energy sector not to be so reliant, so sensitive to this kind of international development. We don't seem to have learned much since then.
Well, we were definitely, the lesson we learned from that was that that Europe needs to be less reliant on Russian gas. And actually, by and large, they did quite a good job of weaning themselves off most of it pretty quickly. But that wasn't the same as weaning yourself off gas completely. And in fact, a lot of the Qatari and the US supply basically filled in that gap. So they did pivot away from Russian gas, pivoted towards, in some ways, gas coming out of the Gulf. Now, you can see this in two different ways, and the argument is being made. The argument is being made two ways. One is what you need to do is get off fossil fuels. They come from conflict-ridden parts of the world, often from people you don't particularly want to be friends with, and that's why you need renewables. Others are saying that's never going to fill the gap. What we need to do is drill and find some of our own resources. That debate is alive and well right now in the UK. You can see it from both angles, but at the end of the day, there aren't that many places where gas comes out of the ground, and wherever it does, there's usually trouble.
And it's interesting to see Iran clearly using this as a weapon of war to take on a mighty opponent. What other countries might have that in their sights and might be looking at this thinking, right, okay, that's how conflict is going to play out in the future?
It's no surprise, is it, I think, to see Iran doing this. And if the US didn't see this coming, they really should have done, because obviously they're militarily no match for either Israel or the United States. But they do have some very, very powerful things they can flex, like the Straits of Hormuz, lots of other energy infrastructure are within missile range. I suppose there's no other area in the world where it's as concentrated as this. Obviously there's parts of West Africa where there's lots of oil. There's the Gulf of Mexico. There's Venezuela, and we've seen obviously. And I don't think in all of this we should forget the China angle on this. When the US thinks about stuff, it thinks mainly about how does this affect us versus China. And if you look at Venezuela, where they got a sort of friendly interim person in there, Venezuela is 3% of China's oil. Iran is 16%. You add those two together, that's 19%. That is not insignificant. If you had useful people that you could have influence over who are supplying nearly a fifth of China's oil, that gives you a bit of leverage when it comes to intense negotiations in the future, which will be China's got all the rare earth metals. If the US has got a stranglehold on some of their energy, that's a basis for negotiation. I think that don't forget the China angle in all this, because China and other Asian economies are much more reliant than the West on exactly these sources of energy.
And Simon, just to finish where we started, in terms of the impact on you and I, the biggest factor by the sound of it is how long this goes on. That will determine how many months or years of economic pain we're talking about.
Yeah, so the duration of it is really important. But I go back to my comments about how pervasive it is. We've just had the three central banks, the US, the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, all not cut interest rates when a lot of people expected them to do that. And that's because the inflationary impact of this means that they don't. So when you see what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz, it's affecting the cost of your mortgage. And in fact, mortgage rates have gone up by about half a percentage point. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's gone from 3.75 to 4.25. That's half a percentage point. If you're borrowing a couple of £100,000 or dollars, that makes a great deal. So it does affect every facet of your life. And like I say, and you've pointed out, all depends on how long this lasts. The estimation for how long it lasts, that has just got longer given the events of the last 48 hours.
Simon, thank you. That's the BBC's business editor, Simon Jack. And if you'd like to hear more of the Global News podcast, click the link below. Thank you for joining us.